And good evening. It's October 1st, 2024, and welcome to another one of our branches on the vine with another episode from the folks at Aleph Beta. So in this video, we're going to discuss some of the ponder points from Rabbi Daniel Lowenstein of Aleph Beta. Fire and brimstone. Again? I love inverted thinking and I love being an example, whether we like it or not. So welcome this evening to another thought-provoking episode from Aleph Beta with Fire and Brimstone again tonight on The Dusty Feet. And before we forget, if you find these kinds of podcasts useful, then click the subscribe button. The reminders, they just help you. But also, you think these might be useful to others, that's when you click that like button, because that is the way that YouTube chooses to share these to more people, if they wish. So, as anyone who's followed this channel for a while, right, you know that I tend to think upside down at times, because I often look for another perspective to consider. But in this video, Daniel does it for me. Yes, a view on a particular metaphor will need to be addressed at one point, and I tend to agree with where Daniel gets his position from. But that gives us direction and a starting point. And I could not help but have a few additional thoughts. So, let's peek at this video, and we're going to discuss things that might come our way. Enjoy.
Hi, I'm Daniel Lowenstein, and you're watching Aleph Beta. Welcome to Parshat Nitzavim. In the beginning of the Parsha, Moshe tells the Israelites that God is formally inducting them into his covenant. He will be their God, and they will be his nation. And just after this declaration, Moshe turns to a related, uncomfortable topic. What happens if someone decides to violate the covenant? Lo yoveh Hashem saloach lo, the Torah says. God will not forgive him. Rather, his wrath will burn against this sinner, and terrible curses will befall him. Now, that doesn't sound so pleasant, but it also sounds a little generic, right? If someone sins, punishment will be meted out. We've heard that sort of thing in the Torah before. But then, there's something in the Parsha's description of these punishments that we don't really hear anywhere else. We're told that God will rain down fire and brimstone, bringing total destruction and desolation. Desolation, the Torah says, kemapechat Sdom va'Amorah, just like what happened to Sdom and Amorah, those cities that God destroyed in his wrath all those years ago. Sulfur, salt, scorched earth, blackened fields, and an utter absence of life. That's a haunting visual. And it's also incredibly uncommon. There are plenty of descriptions of devastation and punishment in the Torah, but the Torah never compares any of them to Sdom. So why does the Torah do it here? Is Sdom just a handy image of total ruin, an easy way to convey the horror of the scene? Or is there something more? Is there something about the story of Sdom that's also being echoed in our Parsha? Well, there's one way to find out. Let's take a closer look at the text here in Nitzavim and see if there's anything else that points us to Sdom. The Torah begins by saying, maybe there's a person or family or tribe who doesn't want to follow God's covenant. V'hidbarich belvavo le'mor shalom yihyeh li. And he'll bless himself in his heart and say, I'll have peace. Ki bishrirut libi elech. I'll follow my heart's will, and I'll still be fine. And why is he so sure? L'man sefot harava et hatznea. Because the well-watered will sweep along the parched. Oh, yeah, that's why. Of course. This last line is clearly some cryptic metaphor, and I talk about some of the theories the commentators have about it in a blog post linked in the description. But the explanation that makes the most sense to me is the one suggested by Rosh Shimshon Raphael Hirsch. He argues that the well-watered and the parched are metaphors for the righteous and the wicked. Making the meaning of the verse, the righteous will sweep along the wicked with them. And that means that the sinner is essentially thinking something like this. I can do whatever I want, and I won't suffer any consequences for it. You know why? Because there are all these righteous folks about, and God promised them peace and prosperity and a whole bunch of good things. So, he thinks, what's God gonna do? Give them all that good stuff, but not me? Can't happen. When it rains for everyone. When there's peace for everyone. My little patch of land isn't gonna suffer a mini famine. Enemies aren't going to drop a bomb on my house but leave everyone else alone. So, by that logic, I'll get swept along in the tide of everyone else's blessings. God's not gonna destroy them just to get to me. So I'm safe. Okay, so this guy is a sleaze. He knows full well that he's sinning, but he smugly reassures himself. He blesses himself in his heart, because he thinks he can get away with it. He thinks that he's got God in a corner, that God's hands are tied. But we're looking for stone connections here. Is there anything about this guy that specifically reminds us of the story of that wayward city? Now, before we all start flipping back to Bereshit to check, let's look at one more thing here in Nitzavim. In the midst of describing this sinner's punishment, we get this strange digression, where the Torah tells us all about these different groups of spectators, these people who witness the devastation God brings down. The Torah says, "Ve'amar hador ha'acharon," a later generation will remark, "B'nechem asher yukumu me'acharechem," your children who will come after you, "Ve'hanochri asher yavo me'eretz rechoka," and foreigners coming from distant lands. They'll see this sulfur and salt and scorched earth. Ve'amru kol hagoyim, and all of these nations will say, Al me'asa Hashem kacha la'aretz hazot. Why did God do this to this land? What made him so angry? Ve'amru, and they'll conclude, Al asher azvu et brit Hashem. It must be that those who are punished abandon the covenant of God. There's just no other explanation. Now, we kind of have to wonder, why does the Torah feel the need to tell us all about these future generations and foreign nations who are going to sit and schmooze about these punishments? A sinner sins, and God punishes him. Isn't that the end of the story? Why do I need to hear about these people standing around munching on their popcorn and staring wide-eyed as they watch the punishment unfold? Does it matter? Is this important? It must be, if the Torah goes into so much detail, but it's not at all clear why it would be. But let me ask you, does any of this remind you of Sodom? Are future generations and foreign nations part of that story? I think that both of the elements we saw, the sinner who expects to be treated like the righteous, and the children and foreign nations who are watching from the sidelines, are actually very reminiscent of one particular part of the Sodom story. I'm thinking of the very beginning of the story, when God first reveals to Abraham what he plans to do to the wayward city. So come with me to Bereshit chapter 18, and I'll explain what I mean. The story begins with God speaking to himself. He knows he's planning on destroying Sodom, but there's one thing he doesn't seem to be sure about. He says, "Hamechasa ani me Avraham asher ani oseh?" Am I going to hide from Abraham what I plan to do? V'Avraham hayo yihya l'goy gadol ve'atzum. Abraham is going to become a great and powerful nation. V'nivruchu vo kol goyei haaretz. And all of the nations of the earth will be blessed through him. Abraham has this great destiny ahead of him. He's going to become an inspiration and a source of blessing for the world. So, yes, I'm God, and I don't need to explain myself to anyone. But maybe I should. Ki yedativ, for I've come to know him. L'ma'an asher yitzaveh et banav ve'beito acharav. And Abraham is going to instruct his children and his household that will come after him. V'shamru derech Hashem la'asot tzedakah u'mishpat. So that they'll keep the way of God, doing what's right and what's just. Abraham is going to teach his children to follow me, to always do what's right. And for that to happen, God seems to be saying, I need to show him my ways. He needs to understand how I think. He needs to understand what tzedakah u'mishpat, righteousness and justice, really are. And so, God reveals to Abraham his plans to destroy Sodom. So let's stop here for a minute. Did anything we just read sound familiar? Well, actually, yeah. For one, God describes the role of Abraham and his descendants as v'nivrechuvo kol goyei haaretz. All of the nations of the land will be blessed through him. Was there any mention of blessing in Nitzavim? There was. In our parsha, the sinner is described as v'hitbarech belvavo le'mor shalom yihyali. He blesses himself in his heart, reassuring himself he'll be fine despite his errant ways. So there's blessing in both of these stories. But there's something very different about these blessings. Think about their direction. Where do they start and where do they end? In Bereshit, Avraham is the source of bracha, and through him, everyone else gets blessed. So the blessing moves from Avraham outward to the rest of the world. But what about on Nitzavim? What's the direction of the blessing there? Well, there it's inward. V'hitbarech belvavo. He blesses himself. It almost suggests a kind of inverse relationship between Avraham in Bereshit and the sinner in our parsha. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. Bracha is a pretty common word in the Torah. It would be rash to read too much into the blessing connection. Is there anything else that's familiar about this section? I think there is. Let me ask you, how exactly are Avraham and his descendants meant to be sources of blessing to the nations of the world? How does it work? Is it magic? Some spiritual force emanating from him and washing over everyone else? Well, the text doesn't really spell it out, but in another Parsha video, Rabbi Foreman makes the case that Avraham was actually meant to serve as a role model. He and his descendants would stand for all the right values, and the rest of the world would have the opportunity to learn from that example. They'd see Abraham's greatness and emulate it, and in doing so, their own good deeds would earn them blessing from God. Now, if that's true, well then, who is Avram really responsible to teach? Who is meant to learn God's ways from him? We know God expects him to teach Banav ubeito acharav, his children who will come after him. But is that it? Not really. He will teach his household, and through them, the lessons will spread outward to kol goyei haaretz, all the nations of the world. And who were the spectators in Parshat Nitzavim? Who was the audience remarking about the devastation? B'neichem asher yakumu me'acharechem, your children that will come after you, and kol hagoyim, all the other nations. Do you see that? It's the same people. Abraham is charged with teaching the right and the just to his descendants and to the nations of the world. And in Nitzavim, the Israelites' descendants and the nations of the world are the ones witnessing this stone-like punishment. Isn't that crazy? And we're not done yet. Take a look at what happens next in the stone story. God decides to reveal his plans to Abraham, and Abraham responds with a challenge. He says that it wouldn't be right, it wouldn't be fair to destroy the city. Ha'af tispeh tzadik im rasha, he asks. Will you, God, sweep away the righteous along with the wicked? Chalil alacha, Abraham says. What a terrible, unjust thing it would be to destroy a whole city and punish the righteous within it for the sins of the wicked. If anything, he argues, it should be the other way around. The wicked within the city should be spared because of the righteous. So, let me ask you, is there anything familiar about Abraham's words? Ha'af tispeh tzadik im rasha. Yes, the word tispeh, will you sweep along, it's the same word as sfot from our parsha. L'man sfot haravat hatzmeah, the well-watered will sweep along the parched. And it's not just the word that's the same. The sinner in our parsha was reassuring himself that he'd be safe, because he'd be swept along with the righteous. Because God doesn't punish the righteous just to get to the wicked. It's exactly the same argument that Abraham is making. God, don't punish the righteous just to get to the wicked. Only, it's not really the same, is it? There's a glaring difference between Abraham and the sinner. Yes, they're using the same argument, but to what end? What is each one trying to accomplish? Well, Abraham is arguing on behalf of the people of stone. He's trying to protect others. But the sinner, he's twisting the argument to try to protect himself. It's a total perversion of the logic. This sinner is taking Abraham's selfless defense of the wicked and turning it into something corrupt and selfish. So let's stop for a minute and take stock of what we have here. We've got all these links between these two sections: bracha, children and foreign nations, svot tispeh, and the wicked being spared for the righteous. The reference to Stom and Nitzavim is shaping up to be much more than just a handy image. There's something bigger going on, a deeper reason why the sinner in Nitzavim receives the punishment of Stom. But what is it? Well, let's go back to God's plan for Abraham for a minute and think about it. What did God say he was hoping for? He wanted Abraham to become a great nation, and for that nation to serve as a beacon of inspiration, as one giant role model for the rest of the world. This nation would keep his Torah, they would follow in his ways, they'd pursue tzedakah u'mishpat, and everyone would look to them for moral and spiritual guidance. But the fact is, there's more than one way to teach the world what justice and righteousness look like. People can learn by example from those who are great and virtuous. They can be inspired by the good that others do. But people can also grow by seeing firsthand what cruelty and selfishness look like, and being repulsed by them. Seeing how the lives of the morally bankrupt are empty and sad, and seeing how God ultimately deals with those people. And in that sense, the immoral can be role models also, for how not to live. And so, in Nitzavim, as we sign on the dotted line, so to speak, and agree to be God's nation, God says, this covenant means you're going to be my role models, one way or the other. If you keep the Torah, if you pursue tzedakah u'mishpat and walk in my ways, if you follow the path of Abraham, then that's how you'll fulfill your end of the deal here. And that's what we're all hoping for. But there is this chance that someone won't be interested, that he'll say, I want to do what I want to do. I'm not interested in this role modeling gig, being all virtuous so others can grow through me. And so, instead of carrying the weight of others, I'm going to make everyone else carry my weight. I'm going to cheat the system and make the merits of everyone else work for me so that I can do whatever I want. And that's something beyond a regular sin. That's a total rejection of the mission, a corruption of it. But you know what? It doesn't work. He's still going to end up being a role model. Those people he's supposed to teach and inspire, they'll learn what they're meant to anyway. That's what it means to be a part of God's nation. It'll just happen in a different way, a way that's a lot less pleasant than the way it could have been. So what's the bottom line? God invited us to be his nation and to show the world his ways. How that happens, that's up to us. Thanks for watching. If you want to learn more about God's vision for Abraham as a role model, you definitely want to check out Rabbi Foreman's video, What is Israel's Purpose in the World? You can find the link in the description. Happy watching.
So I love Daniel in this. So as I listened to this video, a few things came to mind. They were upside down, probably more like inverted, right? And there was that uncomfortable thought of being an example, whether you like it or not, right? And the uncomfortable topic of unforgiveness, because that's present in both the Old and New Testaments. Though we often ignore it, it's uncomfortable to address. But what I like about this was that this one addressed us. It looked inward. It addressed followers of God. Because it's easy for us to point fingers at those who are not following God. We love to rile them up. But you know, our social media is resplendent with all that finger pointing. But here, this is a look at us, followers of God. I mentioned this before. I'm not a fan of the traditional heaven-hell picture, that Dante's Inferno picture that exists in traditional churchianity. Yet even here, there's a little thought about God's judgment. But something is interesting that I think that we, in our penchant to want to see justice, because if we don't see it, then somebody else got away with it. But if we don't see something happen to them, then maybe it won't happen. Maybe it won't happen to us. So here we get this point where God seems to be addressing this particular point. And then this metaphor is what makes us think. Because I don't think we actually see little people around getting fire and brimstone bombs on them as they wander. But I think what we see here in this particular one, this particular part of Scripture, is that we're addressing what happens if we are aware of something like this. We're asking God, what happens when? Because then God says, let me give you a mental picture. I mean, Moses is sharing this with the people. So we have this mental picture. I don't think you're going to get away with it, because if you follow me, I'm the guide you're going to follow. Then there are points where you need to agree to be this example. I don't think we look at our lives that way when we have our traditional churchianity way of doing things. I don't think we get that little thing when we say something and then we agree to be an example in our lives for good or for bad. That almost seems like a wedding vow point where he goes, for better or for worse. Except with this, it's our view that when people look at us, for better or for worse, well, you'll be an example. I think the most significant point that hit me truly was that we are the example, for better or for worse. I will say from my perspective anyways, that I think a lot of the confusion in the world is that people think that what we're doing is better. I think I'm more compelled to say it's probably the inversion of that. But then again, that's my perspective for sure. It's nothing that I say here is judgment in any way. Any way, any shape, any form. It's merely that God's saying he will have the final say. I think our frustration is when we see the world's condition today, and with us as believers. So what choice is our influence? That's an interesting question to think about. I think it's interesting because I might expect some people to say, with this, well, that's for Torah, so that's for their side. I'm just not sure that fits here, because God talks about those following him, those choosing to follow him. We're going to be an example for him. We're going to get the same thing mentioned in the New Testament. Jesus mentions this as well. So this kind of thing goes along with that. I mean, his father said, which makes sense because he only said anything that his father said. So we have this point of being a follower of God. It's that they're looking at us. That's, again, an interesting example, and maybe something that should cause us to, in our lives, to stop, pause, take stock, ponder. I'm going to bring it up again. We see ourselves and we see others, just like this metaphor, we see here because we know this. There weren't little fire and brimstone drops. I mean, everybody wasn't wandering around. Those agreed to follow God, and then that didn't happen. But don't forget again, they had agreed to follow God. And then God turned and said, "You're not following me. You said it, but you're not following me." Here comes the fire and brimstone again. So this is something to ponder. I mean, because it's also speaking, we have a time later where you're not going to get away from God. There's no way that you're going to get away from God. So if you think you're getting away with something now, at least according to Scripture, we have that in both the Old and New Testaments again. But then we have challenges when you don't follow God the way God expects you to follow him. Because we mentioned before that we were his representatives, as his priestly representatives to the nations. And then Rabbi Lowenstein brings it up the point that, well, that's being an example. And we don't get away from that. There's no hiding from that. You're an example. People see our social media as people seeing everything else on steroids. So yes, people see. There's no way around it. Do you think God didn't see it? I liked how Rabbi Lowenstein drew this out from this particular Torah passage, right? Because I was thinking one of the more vital points that I got was that inward, outward pointing, right? In other words, I liked how they said, hey, Abraham, he's thinking about everyone else. That's what he's doing, right? So how God is doing that, and the expectations are about us, and the expectations radiate outwards, and it's as in going from us. So when we see this upside down, this inverted in this particular example, because it makes it about us, because we think we're going to reap the benefits, because we think it's all for me. I think it's intriguing to consider that I'm only following God because of what I get out of it. Did you hear what I said? I'm only following God because of what I get out of it. And yet, with God at this particular point, he's making it clear that it's really about everyone else. It's that upside down. It's an inverted way of that. It's about being experienced by other people. You know, the experience part is interesting because one could say that in observing, as people are watching, the experience that they're not seeing might be as strong as the example of what they should be seeing. I know it's a bit challenging. I expect it's going to be much pondering about that particular thought. Because what should be and what is not seen, it might be as strong as what's seen. Because at times I think we unintentionally, we have it focused on us in our traditional church-anity way of doing things. What I get. What little things that we say, now I'm not going to get punished, right? I'm not, whatever that is, about me. And yet we see, not only do we have it with one Mount event, or getting here with the Torah being given, but we also have Jesus saying the same thing, that your life and what you do in that Sermon on the other Mount, well, that makes it relatively clear. It's how your life's been lived as an example. Because when people are being seen, you know, it's hard for you to experience words like humble without being involved in a community. Goes with the territory. So it does draw some things to think about, to ponder. You know, there are many questions here. The answers are, I'm still trying to figure out the answers. But I think it's more about responses. And the responses, how do we respond? What are our choices? Because what is seen does ask for things to think about. I mean, it continues to challenge me that God would say, following me was about being an example to the nations. And then he turns and goes, but no, it's no longer being an example. Now you're just going to talk to them, have them say this, and then everything's good. But that doesn't seem to me to be the consistent, unchanging, ever-loving God that we see and we want. But we want justice from and mercy from. We tend to think that justice is for them mercy is for us. I just think we get the whole package. I mean, God is looking at us and saying, I expect you to behave. I expect you to be an example. I expect you to be my representatives to the nations. In the stories, we've seen that. Some with success, some lacking success. But then we learn, we grow, we experience, and then we share those experiences, and we live our experiences amongst other people, and, like it or not, as examples for others to see. Okay, so I want to wrap this up with this thought. When he was talking about Abraham and Sodom and Gomorrah, Abraham was with God and he was just pushing back. God says what he wants to do and Abraham sees it differently. Abraham's actually interceding. It's an interesting point. Would we today be accused of the same pushback that Adam is giving God for Sodom and Gomorrah? Because that's interesting. It's also uncomfortable. Because if we, you and I chose these words specifically, I said, would we be accused of interceding in the same way that Abraham interceded for people here with Sodom and Gomorrah? Would we do that? Can we do that? Is it even worth considering? As I said, there are many things that I brought up here, many things to ponder. And again, I don't think there are as many answers as probably just responses. Because as we see with Abraham's response to God, that's where his heart was. Because I think if you notice all of that, the most evident thing that God is looking at is his heart. All of his heart. Because I think there seems to be a pretty strong tie-in, a pretty strong red string connecting these two mountain events, right? Mount Sinai and the Sermon on the Mount. Because our heart's at the core. We see that throughout. Do we choose to be the example? Because remember, this is about us, right? This is about Sodom and Gomorrah consequences, but they're pointed at us. We might not see it in this lifetime, but it's going to be interesting to see if or why it should be escaped in the next. So, shalom, shalom. Thank you for being with us on another episode of Branches on the Vine with Rabbi Daniel Lowenstein and the folks at Aleph Beta on the Dusty Feet.